Open your Bibles with me to Judges chapter 13. Judges 13. We're going to be continuing our sermon series here. A man named John Whittier once wrote, "For all sad words of tongue or pen, the saddest are these, it might have been." And I think of that, wasted opportunity, those kind of things, potential squandered. And maybe the exhibit A of that, it would be Samson. When you think about what he was blessed with and what he could have done and should have done versus how his story turned out, it's really just a tragic kind of story. And yet, it ends on a good note. Now, if you think about how the story ended, you might be surprised that I would say that, but we'll save that for another lesson. We're not going to get all the way through the story today. We're going to probably do this in two parts, but today we're going to cover Samson's life from birth to his wedding as a young man. So it begins in Judges chapter 13, and we're skipping over several judges that came after Gideon. For one thing, Gideon had a son named Abimelech, and it's not clear whether he was one of the judges or not, because he was kind of a rotten guy. So depending on how you count the judges and whether you include him or not, you had him. And then there were people like Tola, Jair, Jephthah. Jephthah's got an interesting story. You might remember his rash vow that about whatever comes out of the door first, I will offer to the Lord. I've got an idea for a lesson that I've done before where we'll circle back and touch on Jephthah in a kind of a review, but we're not going to go through his story in depth in this series. After him, at the end of chapter 12, at the end of Jephthah, there comes in quick succession Isban, Elon, and Abdon. And you could see that if you turn back a page that there's about 2 verses for each one. It doesn't tell us much about them other than maybe the size of their family and how long they were judged. And then we come to Samson's story, which interestingly takes up 4 whole chapters, the most of anybody's story in the book of Judges. That's the most text, I guess we'd say, dedicated to one person. So when you've got like these judges and all you know about them is, a verse or two, and then suddenly we have a big chunk of the book dedicated to Samson, that tells us there's something interesting that we're supposed to learn from his life. And I think there's quite a few lessons that we can learn from Samson. And I think he's surprisingly relatable. And I hope that I can bring that out today as we look at this first half of his life, that Samson, if we look at him in the right way, I think we see someone that perhaps is very relatable to us today. So his story begins with a birth announcement by angels. And that's in Judges 13, verse 1. The people of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. So the Lord gave them into the hand of the Philistines for 40 years. There was a certain man of Zorah, of the tribe of the Danites, whose name was Manoah, and his wife was barren and had no children. And the angel of the Lord appeared to the woman and said to her, "Behold, you are barren and have not borne children, but you shall conceive and bear a son." Boy, when you hear those words, that's big stuff. Think about the other people who've heard this message. You will have a son. Well, Abraham and Sarah heard that about their son Isaac. There was an angelic announcement. There was an angelic announcement to Zechariah and Elizabeth that they would have a son. His name would be John. And of course, there was an angelic announcement to Joseph and Mary that they would have a son. His name would be Jesus. That puts Samson in some rare company. And I can't think of any others where an angel came to tell the mother that you're going to have a son. And so when you think about those people and their importance in the scheme of things in God's plan, really Samson is already in just a very small company of people whose birth was announced and foretold, and there's big plans for him. Verse 4 says, "Therefore be careful and drink no wine or strong drink. Eat nothing unclean. For behold, you shall conceive and bear a son. No razor shall come upon his head, for the child shall be a Nazirite to God from the womb. He shall begin to save Israel from the hand of the Philistines." You may recall that Elizabeth received similar instructions concerning John, that he was not to drink any wine or those kind of things. He wasn't specifically called a Nazirite, but it seems to indicate that maybe he was a Nazirite. Now, if you were to go back to number 6 and read about the Nazirite vow, it's normally a temporary vow. Like somebody could dedicate themselves to this vow for some period of time, and there was instructions for what to do when you finished your vow. So if you were going to do this for a year or whatever, then at the conclusion of that time, you follow these things, offer this sacrifice, and sort of, so it was normally a vow that you would enter into for a certain period of time. But in the case of Samson and probably John, it was something that was from birth. This was going to be their entire way of life, was living by these special rules that applied to the Nazirites. We also see here that God has a plan for Samson's life, that he's going to begin the liberation of Israel from the Philistines. He would not accomplish that completely. In fact, all the way into Samuel's day and David's day, you'll recall, the Philistines were still kind of a thorn in their side. So it's going to be, they will eventually completely be done with them, but it takes a little while. But it's going to start during Samson's time as judge. So verse 6, the woman came and told her husband, a man of God came to me, and his appearance was like the appearance of the angel of God, very awesome. I did not ask him where he was from, and he did not tell me his name. Just think about how excited she would be to relate this to him. And, she doesn't know where he was from or his name. And that almost reminds me of conversations I have with Sarah whenever I'm telling her something. And then she starts saying, well, did you ask this? And did you ask that? I never asked the right questions. Eddie can sympathize with that. It's like, no, I didn't ask that. I didn't ask that. So she didn't ask, and she's missing some of the information, but she says by his appearance, he was like an angel of God. And she tells that they're going to have a son, and she relates to him in verse 7 the exact instructions that she was given. So she got all the important information. She's got it, and she's got that, and she shared it with her husband. We're going to have a son. Here's the rules. So Manoah, and this has always been kind of funny to me, but he wants to hear this for himself. Understandably, he missed out on an angelic vision. He wants to hear this for himself. So verse 8 and 9, Manoah prayed to the Lord and said, oh, Lord, please let the man of God whom you sent, see, he doesn't know if he's an angel at this point, come again to us and teach us what we are to do with the child who will be born. And God listened to the voice of Manoah, and the angel of God came again to the woman as she sat in the field, but Manoah, her husband, was not with her. I don't know why, that's just funny to me. But Manoah's like, we need to hear this again. And God says, okay. So the angel goes again. And of course, Manoah's wanting to see the angel himself, or the man of God. But the angel comes back to the woman. This is the person who he had appeared to. And he's going to give her the same information. But verse 10, she runs quickly and gets her husband. She said, behold, the man who came to me the other day has appeared to me. So he arose and went with his wife and came to the man and said, are you the man who spoke to this woman? He said, I am. Manoah said, now, when your words come true, what is to be the child's manner of life, and what is his mission? And the angel of the Lord said to Manoah, of all that I said to the woman, let her be careful. She may not eat of anything that comes from the vine. Let her not drink any wine or strong drink or any unclean thing. All that I commanded her, let her observe. Again, I think this is just kind of, a little bit relatable maybe. But I can almost imagine that his wife was kind of looking at him like, it's pretty much word for word what she had told him. But he didn't, he wanted to hear from the angel himself. And there's no new information here at all. This is basically a repeat, word for word, of what he said the first time he came and talked to her. And she did get it right. And but Manoah needed to hear it, I guess. And so anyway, maybe I'm the only one that can relate to that, being in that boat. But anyway, so it's just funny to me, this little interaction between Manoah and his wife. But imagine how excited. They're going to have a son. She's been barren. That's the big news. And even bigger than that, that he's going to be special. He's going to be dedicated to the Lord. He's going to serve God as a judge. Now, after this, Manoah offers to cook a meal. The angel says, no, but if you will make something, offer a sacrifice to God. And so he prepares a meal. And as he offers the sacrifice, the fire goes up, and the angel goes up in the flame and disappears. And that's when they realize that they had seen an angel. In verse 17 and 18, Manoah said before that happened to the angel, "What is your name, so that when your words come true, we may honor you?" And the angel of the Lord said to him, "Why do you ask me my name, seeing it is wonderful?" That same word is used in Psalm 139, where David says that God knows everything about him before he even says a word. God knows everything, and he says, "Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. I cannot attain it." So this idea of wonderful is like something beyond comprehension. It's just too amazing to wrap your head around. And so the angel is saying that his name, for whatever reason, is wonderful. And I think that's interesting to think about. So then he goes up in the flame, and Manoah decides, "Oh no, we've seen the Lord, we're going to die." And his wife says in verse 23, "If the Lord meant to kill us, he would not have accepted a burnt offering and a grain offering at our hands, or shown us all these things, or announced such things as these," which is kind of obvious too, right? Why would he appear and say, "You're going to have a child," and then kill them? That wouldn't make any sense at all. So Manoah's wife is really, to me, is really looking, maybe it's kind of obvious why the angel appeared to her with this information all along. And so in due time, verse 24, the woman bore a son and called his name Samson. And the young man grew, and the Lord blessed him. And the Spirit of the Lord began to stir him in Mahaneh Da, between Zorah and Eshtaol. This is the region of Dan in the middle of the, kind of in the Galilee region. It's right there in the middle of Israel. So far, so good. This sounds like the story. If you didn't know how it goes, it's like, okay, this is the hero has come because the people are in trouble. They've cried out to God for a deliverer. An angel has come, and he said a child is going to be born. He's going to save the people. And that's the story. That's the beginning of that's the beginning of a good story. Now he's grown up. The Lord has blessed him, and it's time for him to go and deliver the people from their enemies. That's what we're expecting to happen, right? I mean, if you didn't know how the story goes, that's what you might think is going to happen. But instead, there comes a big turn of the story in chapter 14 when Samson is basically grown now. And it says he went down to Timnah. That's not very far away from where he was already. It was one of the cities in their region. And at Timnah, he saw one of the daughters of the Philistines. And he came up and told his father and mother, "I saw one of the daughters of the Philistines at Timnah. Now get her for me as my wife." But his father and his mother said to him, "Is there not a woman among the daughters of your relatives or among all the people that you must go to take a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines?" But Samson said to his father, "Get her for me, for she is right in my eyes." So now Samson, and this is going to be basically what drives him, what motivates him most of the time from here on, is going to be what is right in his eyes. That's his moral compass, right? I think a lot of people, that's their moral compass. We'll come back to that. But Samson says, "Good for me." In other words, she looks good to me, obviously, right? She's attractive. And as far as he can see, that's what he wants. And so he's going to be driven by his desire. So verse 4, his father and his mother did not know it was from the Lord, for he was seeking an opportunity against the Philistines. At that time, the Philistines ruled over Israel. I read a thing about this that said this might be the most important verse of the whole Samson story. I thought, that's interesting. It is a very interesting verse, and I had to kind of like think about it for a while. So his mother and father did not know this was from the Lord. So does God want Samson to break the law and go marry a uncircumcised Philistine? Is this pleasing to God? I don't think so at all. This was not the right thing to do. But what was God wanting? God was wanting Samson to fight the Philistines and to defeat them. That was what his purpose was. Remember, the angel told his mother, he will begin to deliver the people from the Philistines. Now and he's been gifted and he's been given the responsibility and the opportunity and everything to take this fight to the enemy. But he's not doing that. In fact, what he's doing is doing whatever is right in his eyes. He's just doing what he wants to do. And it seems to me that God is going to arrange things so that he's going to end up fighting with the Philistines. It's, he can sort of do it God's way or he can do it this way, but God's will is going to be accomplished either way. And it reminds me of what was said to Esther. The Lord is going to raise up take care of his people. You have to choose how your part in this is going to go. And I think that's basically what's happening here with Samson. So we'll think about that as well as we go through the story. Now, as he travels to Timnah, he's attacked by a lion, which he kills with his bare hands. And then in verse 8, after some days, he returned to take her, his wife, or basically going down to marry her. And as he turned aside to see the carcass of the lion, behold, there was a swarm of bees in the body of the lion and honey. And he scraped it out into his hands and went on, eating as he went. And he came to his father and mother and gave some to them, and they ate. But he did not tell them that he had scraped the honey from the carcass of the lion. I never gave this a whole lot of thought, but several people that have written about this have seen something important in this little incident, besides the fact that clearly we see that, okay, Samson is no normal person. He's able to grab a lion with his bare hands and kill it. So he's got some supernatural kind of strength and ability, which we're going to see over and over through the story, of course. But this is our first introduction to that. Okay, he's not just your average guy. This lion's coming and he can rip it in half. But then he comes back and he finds this honey, which is always just kind of interesting. Some suggest that, part of the Nazirite vow was that you don't drink wine, you don't do these things, and you don't cut your hair, and you don't come near a dead body. You can't even help bury one of your relatives if you're part of this Nazirite vow. You have to stay away from dead bodies. Now, some would say that by coming back to this carcass, and he sees the honey there, and he reaches in and he takes it and he eats it, that he's breaking his vow by being around this dead body. And that seems likely. The only reason I'm kind of hesitant about it is others point out, well, it's not real clear if the dead body thing applies to every kind of thing, like all animals, and then you basically have to be a vegetarian in a sense, is it talking about people, human bodies? It's not 100% clear to me. So I can't say for sure that this violated his Nazirite vow, but it was probably unclean. And from the Jewish point of view, it's probably not something. It's interesting. He says he didn't tell his mom and dad where he found the honey, that he scraped it out of a rotting carcass of a lion. But it probably fits into the general motif that Samson sees something he wants, honey. And even though it's in this carcass and it was unclean in its setting, that doesn't matter, because that's what he wants. He likes honey. He wants to eat honey. There's honey. He takes honey. He eats it. This is, again, it kind of fits with his character of being just simply focused on, what do I want? Hey, honey. Honey sounds good. I want it. And not really any consideration for whether this was clean or not in terms of the law, and possibly even if it was against his Nazirite vow, which you would think in the spirit of the thing, it probably was against that, to be messing with this dead, days later, long enough later for bees to have built a hive. I mean, it would have been nasty, but he doesn't care, right? He's just like an appetite-driven person. And so I think there was more there, I guess, than I ever thought about in that little incident. And of course, it comes up again in the riddle in just a few moments. So at the wedding, Samson goes down and prepares a feast. And it says the Philistines provided 30 people to be his companions. So this is like the wedding party. Samson didn't bring any, apparently, groomsmen, but the bride's side has provided him with the groomsmen, the wedding party. So they're all like feasting together. And Samson proposes a challenge to him. I'll give you a riddle, and if you can answer it, then I'll give you 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothes. But if you can't answer it, then you give me 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothes. And then the riddle, of course, is in verse 14, out of the eater came something to eat, out of the strong came something sweet. And in 3 days, they could not solve the riddle. And really, it seems to me to be almost a trick question, because there's no way, unless they were with him, they could have possibly, I don't know if this is the kind of riddle you can think about it and figure it out. I mean, it's very, very specific to exactly the thing that happened to him. And And I think that becomes obvious as it goes along. So what they figure out is they're not going to be able to solve it. So they go to his wife, who's their kinsman, or their, part of their community, and they tell her, you go get the answer or we're going to burn you and your father's house. They're serious about this. And they threaten her, so she wears on him. And this is, again, a theme that'll come up again with Delilah, of course, in the next lesson. But day after day, she kind of wears him down. In verse 17, she wept before him the 7 days the feast lasted. She's just crying. And on the seventh day, he finally told her, because she pressed him hard, and she went and told her people. And so when they come and they answer him, they say, hey, what's sweeter than honey? What's stronger than a lion? He says, if you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have solved this riddle, which is the imagery there, of course, is that it wouldn't be right to go take someone else's, animal, ox or whatever, and work your ground with this. You're stealing. It belongs to him. They had come and taken his wife, and they had used her for their advantage. And so that's what he knows, that they must have cheated to get the answer, which I think also reveals that he knows it wasn't really a fair riddle, because, the only way they could have possibly known it is to talk to his wife, because there's no way they could have figured this out on their own. So regardless, verse 19, the Spirit of the Lord rushed on him, and he went down to Ashkelon and struck down 30 men of the town and took the spoil. And then he gave the garments to those who had told the riddle. In hot anger, he went back to his father's house. Remember, he owed them, because they won, he owed them 30 changes of clothes. So the way he gets that is he goes and kills 30 people, gets their stuff, and gives it to them. Now, in spite of himself, he's beginning to stir up trouble with the Philistines, right? And remember, this was his purpose. He's supposed to go off and fight the Philistines. This is the way that it's coming about, because it seems like he's going about everything backwards and the wrong way. But God, in his way, is going to work this out to accomplish his plan regardless. And this is just the beginning of the conflict. So he's so angry, he just goes home without his wife. And verse 20 says his wife was given to his companion, who had been his best man. So, Samson, in hot anger, leaves and just goes home, apparently doesn't say anything. And then there she is, there's her father, and it's like, well, I guess he doesn't want to marry anymore. He's gone back home. And so she gets married to this other guy. So verse 1 says, after some days, at the time of wheat harvest, Samson went to visit his wife with a young goat. So, maybe he calmed down, and now he decides he does want her after all. And he goes and he says, I will go to my wife in the chamber. But her father would not let him go in. And her father told him, I really thought you utterly hated her. So I gave her to your companion. Is not her sister more beautiful than she? Please take her instead. This, again, somebody else pointed out that even her father seems to realize what drives Samson, that he's just purely like a lustful kind of person. And it's like, look, she's beautiful. So seems like he's kind of zeroed in on the kind of man that Samson is. And Samson said to him, this time I shall be innocent in regard to the Philistines when I do them harm. And so you remember, he catches the foxes and he ties their tails together and he turns them loose in the field. He burns down their grain fields. He burns down their heaps of grain for their harvest and their olive orchard. So he, in anger, because they had done this, he burns down all this stuff. And then that leads to another conflict. I'm kind of skipping ahead because I want to get to the application part. But by the end of the chapter, he's single-handedly killed 1,000 Philistines with the jawbone of a donkey. So at the end of the chapter, lest we think that God has completely abandoned him at this point, verse 18, he was thirsty, and he called upon the Lord and said, you've granted this salvation by the hand of your servant, and shall I now die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised? And the Lord split open the hollow place that is in Lehi. Water came from it. He drank, his spirit returned, he revived. Therefore, the name of it is in Hakor, as it is at Lehi to this day. And he judged Israel in the days of the Philistines 20 years. So at the conclusion of this chapter, he's had several fights with the Philistines. He's killed 1,000 of them, and plus some. He's still single, because his wife and her father, they burned with fire. They killed her. So he hasn't got anything for all of his efforts other than he's accomplishing the Lord's purpose. That's what's happening, kind of in spite of himself. And God has taken care of him to this point. And now he judges Israel for 20 years. And we don't know a lot about what happens during that time. It appears that the next thing that happens is like later in life. And we're going to save that for the next lesson. So let's pause now at this point, kind of halfway through, and just think about this story so far and some ways that maybe we can relate to it. The first point is about free will, I think. As we think about this, clearly God had a special plan for Samson. He had, announced his birth. He gave instructions for how he was to be raised. He was going to serve him. But it seems clear to me that Samson had some choice in how he goes about this. Notice how Samson was raised. He was a Nazirite from birth, which again was unusual. He was set apart. He was dedicated to God. He was basically, I think we might compare this to like being raised in the church. Let's think about that for a minute. Imagine if you were blessed to grow up with Christian parents, then from birth, right, they had in mind that you were going to be a Christian. Now, that may not apply to everybody, but let's say that it applies to you. From the time you were born, your parents have in their mind that you're going to grow up and you're going to be this faithful Christian person. And so Samson has to live by certain rules, right? You can't do this, you can't do that, you can't do this. Things that his friends could do, things that everybody else could do, he wasn't allowed to do. Why? Because he was different. He's living by some special rules that don't apply to everybody else. And if you grew up in a Christian home, maybe you felt that way too. Maybe you had to live by certain rules. Maybe you weren't allowed to do what everybody else was doing. And you're kind of trying to live by this certain code of conduct that is maybe stricter than the way that everybody else around you is living. And of course, you may or may not like that when you're growing up. We don't know how Samson felt about it. The fact that he was, kind of had these rules imposed on him. He didn't have a choice in any of that when you think about it. These were decisions that were made by his parents and then enforced on him as he's being brought up. You will be this kind of person. You'll live by these rules. And if you grew up in a Christian home, that's pretty much the story, right? You're not allowed to do these things. You can't watch that. You can't go there. You can't do those things because we're not like the rest of the world. You're going to be different. You're going to be set apart. But it appears that as the chapter turns, in that thing, as he grew, he was blessed and he got older. This is like this, the same thing is said about John and about Jesus. It's like they grew up and then they have to live their life as adults. And that's what happens to all of us. At some point, you grow up and then you've got to live your life. And now I think here's the free will part. It appears to me we have a choice in whether to accept this destiny, if we can say, or this purpose that our parents have been telling us about, that we were raised for, or we can turn away from it. And it seems that as soon as Samson had the ability to make his own choices, he immediately goes the wrong direction. He starts making the wrong choice. He starts living by the new rule, which is, I want what I want, and this is what I want, and that's right in my eyes. And so I think we see that quite a bit, that maybe people maybe you were this way for a while. I think maybe all of us have maybe experienced it to some degree because we've all sinned. But maybe you were raised, and as soon as you got free of the watchful eye or the rule of the mom and dad, and you have the ability to make your own choices, do we just run and do all the stuff that they said never to do? Do we just immediately break the rules and we go do those things? And why? Because that's what we want. That's what our appetite is. That's what we desire. And, hopefully we don't wander off and never come back. That's the fear, that people just leave the Lord. But in this case, we'll have to wait and see how Samson's story ends. But it seems that as the moment he had some freedom, he used that to reject the teaching of his parents, reject the will of God, and to live by a new rule. And that new rule is, I want her because she is right in my eyes. That's said twice. And I want you to turn to the last page of the book of Judges, the last verse, actually. So if you go to the end of the chapter, end of the book, I should say, to Ruth, and then look at the last verse of the book. it says, Judges 21:25, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So Samson seems to be a example kind of the broken morality of the Jews. Remember, the whole Jewish nation was chosen by God to be a special people, to be set apart, to be holy, to serve him. That's what the Jews were supposed to do. But what did they do instead? They just did what was right in their own eyes. And that's a very powerful temptation. When people start to reject the teaching that they've been given or what they've been brought up to do, what they start doing is living by this rule usually, which is, well, I want to do what I feel like is the right thing to do. I'm just going to use my own sense of being a good person. I don't have a problem with this, so I'm going to do it. I think this is good for me. This makes me happy, so that's what I'm going to do because I want to be happy. And surely, and sometimes people say, God would want me to be happy. They throw that in there for good measure. So I know this is what I want. This is going to make me happy. I'm going to do this because this seems like a good idea to me. And if you point out anything about what does the Bible say about that, that sort of doesn't matter because this is what I want to do. And that's living by this rule of everyone doing what's right in their own eyes. The problem with that is, as we know from passages like Proverbs 14:12, there's a way that seems right to a man, but the end is the way to death. We can't really trust our internal compass to guide us the right way. As Jeremiah said in Jeremiah 10:23, "O Lord, I know it is not in man who walks to direct his steps. The way of man is not in himself." So we don't have it in us to be able to just trust our gut and let that call the shots and do whatever feels right in the moment, because probably what that's going to turn into is just being driven by our appetites. And that's what the world, that's the whole, when you read about the description of the Gentiles in the New Testament, they were just led by their appetites. And then they just come up with some justification in their mind for why they want to do this. This is okay. And that's what that life turns into. It's living by your own, doing whatever's right in your own eyes. So again, I think that becomes very relatable on the part of Samson. And we'll see how this continues to lead his life when we continue the lesson. The last point is that one that I've mentioned throughout, which is that God's plan will be done. This is the kind of impossible riddle for us to solve. When you think about a riddle, the riddle to me is, how is it that God gives man free will and God still accomplishes his purpose? And I don't know that we can solve that one. I think when we talk about wonderful and when we talk about such knowledge is too high for me, to me, this is one of those things that is, we just need to settle our minds that we're not going to be able to completely wrap our heads around it. How is it that God is going to always accomplish what he wants, and yet he still gives us some ability to choose? But we know that's the case. Even Job says in Job 42, "I know that you can do all things, and no purpose of yours can be thwarted." That's Job 42, verse 2. No purpose of God's can be thwarted. God's going to accomplish his will. It feels like, from what I gather from all this, what comes through to me is basically like what Mordecai said to Esther. If you do not act, God's still going to save his people, but you and your father's household will perish. We have a choice in how our personal story fits into the big story. But at the end of the day, God's will is going to be done. He's going to save his people. He's going to be victorious. He's going to punish evil. He's going to bring the bride of Christ home for the wedding feast. And he's given us a choice in how do we want to fit into this story. We can rebel against everything that he wants, and God's still going to win. He's still going to get his way. You're not going to change that. You would just change, I think, how your personal story turns out. Or we can be faithful and trust God. And when you think about what might have been, and when you think about Samson's story and the gifts that he was given and the opportunity he had to be one of the greatest heroes, and when you instead see how his life turns out, it is just so tragic. But it's a story that plays out over and over and over and over and over and over and over. And it could even play out for us if we're not careful. So let's remain faithful to the Lord and accept his will in our lives so that he can be glorified through us and we can share in his glory when our life is over. If there's anyone that needs to make your life right with God this morning and begin serving him or make something, confess sin or ask for prayer,